Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Bouncing Back. I'm your host Joanna, and today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is relationships. But specifically, we're going to dive into how we can reclaim attachment security after traumatic relationships. I'd love to welcome our guest, Dr. Lin Hong-hui, to the show. Lin is the founder of the Psychology Atelier in Singapore and is a registered clinical psychologist. Her therapeutic style focuses on individuals' uniqueness and strengths coming from the attachment framework. Now, we also just wanted to mention that this topic can be emotionally activating. So it's important for people to be gentle with themselves. And also, if you feel like you need to step aside or take a moment to yourself, it's important to do so while the episode is going on. So with that, I'd love to welcome Dr. Lin. Hi, how are you today?
Hi, Johanna. How are you? I'm good today. Thank you.
I'm great. Thank you so much for being on the show with us today. I'd love if we could start off with you telling us a bit more about who you are and what it is you do.
Well, I think first and foremost, I'm a person and I'm a mother. And I start with that because that experience organizes so much of than what I do for my profession. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a clinical director of the Psychology Atelier, and my practice has been really shaped by my PhD dissertation, where I research on adult attachment relationships, and that was really like very amazing and mind-blowing for me because we used to know attachment as mainly the relationship between parents and children, but that really opened my eyes to how that continued to shape how we be with ourselves and in relationships for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's such an interesting topic because it's been mentioned so much on social media and it's become a very trending, sensationalized word, this word attachment styles and attachment. So it's going to be really great to dive into that today. But before we do that, we have a section called Have You Met Dr. Lin? So here we're going to get to know you with some little questions. So my first one for you is, what is your favorite book?
Well, I read many attachment books, but I must say my favorite is still Matilda, written by Roald Dahl.
Oh, beautiful.
Yes.
Oh, that's a very cute one. I love that. Normally people give me like some non-fiction books that are really serious, and no, but I love this one. Matilda is such a great one. It's a classic. Great. Well, my next one for you is, what movie have you recently enjoyed?
So I watched Dune on Netflix in preparation for watching Dune 2, but I must say I have not watched Dune 2 yet.
Yeah, they're very long movies. I personally haven't tried watching them. They're a bit long for me, but apparently they're very good. So
yes. Artistically speaking as well, yeah.
Yeah, I think the cinematography is amazing, and it's got one of my favorite actresses in it, Zendaya, and I love her.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I've got a few more here for us. So my next one is, are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
So the latest one I have been listening to and actually really listening to is A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. I really like. Yeah, have you listened to his podcast as well?
I've heard of Eckhart Tolle. He's come up quite a bit on the podcast. People mention him a lot, so I just find that very interesting.
Yeah, so this one that I'm listening to is actually a series of 10 episodes where he together with Oprah Winfrey unpacked the different concepts that he touched on in his book A New Earth. And I found that particularly quite mind opening and resonating because in that he actually drew from different major religions as well as psychology to understand our psyche, and a lot of the things that he touched on are very aligned with mindfulness as well. And I believe we are going to be touching on mindfulness in our sharing today too.
Yeah, definitely. Well, hopefully we can bring some of that into our episode today. Great. Well, I've got one more question here for you, which is, do you have a role model?
You know what, Johanna? I learn from many different people, but I must say the childhood hero who has stuck with me is still Matilda from Roald Dahl.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, because Matilda, she was such an ingenuous girl in the story, and in many ways her story actually is relevant to our topic today because of the experiences that she had with her parents. You could say they were adverse events, but she was able to read and learn many different perspectives to widen her worldview beyond what was being experienced with her parents, and then later on managed to, with her resilience, then come out of that and so to speak, earn her security. So I loved her. Yeah.
Wow. I've never really thought of Matilda in that way, so it's very interesting. So I'm glad that you
Yeah.
brought that up. Thank you.
No worries. She's very fresh in my memory because I just watched a musical, the Matilda the musical as well.
Oh, okay, great. I
Yeah,
love how
yeah.
you love Matilda. That's so refreshing. Great. Well, I'd love to dive into our interview today.
Okay.
So, my first question is just unpacking what attachment styles are. We've heard a lot about it in social media, but what are attachment styles?
Okay, I think in social media, usually we understand attachment styles almost like a personality trait, and for some people, it's almost like a life sentence. It's like once you have an attachment style, it's going to follow you through life. So one thing that we need to note is that attachment style is not a personality trait, but it is a relational strategy that we activate, especially in the context of close relationships, as a way for us to manage threats and negotiate needs. It is enduring in the sense that once there is an sort of like an operating system there, it might really predispose us to behave in certain ways that then confirm our attachment pattern over time, but it can also be shifted. In other words, if we didn't have the benefit of attachment security growing up, we can earn that security later on. And attachment is talking about a special class of relationships that first started with us as babies, or even arguably in our mother's wombs, with our parents. And this moment-to-moment repeated interactions between us and our caregivers, especially when we are distressed, and depending on how they respond or not respond to our needs and emotions, begin to shape the way our brains wire, and it starts to lay the foundation for how we experience, as in how we feel in our body about ourselves, about other people, how we think about ourselves. And usually these are around themes of our self-worthiness and whether we can trust other people to be there for us or not. So that kind of shaping then becomes what we know today as attachment styles.
Great. And what are the attachment styles?
In popular media, there are 4 attachment styles. They have various different names. So the first one will be secure attachment. Then there will be avoidant or dismissing attachment. And then there is anxious or ambivalent attachment. And the last one being unresolved or disorganized. And some call that fearful avoidant attachment. So when we name them as 4 different attachment styles, people start to think that, there are like these 4 very distinct categories of attachment styles, and maybe I fit into one of them. But in reality, it is really much more dynamic than that, because it's a relational strategy. The attachment patterns that get activated really come back to be specific to the individual that we are interacting with. So we might have sort of like a default, but it is not something that is just same over time. And it's also important to understand that these 4 attachment styles are not that much of a neat categories, but they really sit in a 2-dimensional space, meaning at this 2-dimensional space will have the attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance. So every one of us can have different degrees of like low or moderate or high attachment anxiety or avoidance. And within each category of like secure attachment, anxious attachment, or avoidant attachment, we might actually all have pockets of unresolved or what we say trauma.
So I'd love to ask more specifically on the different attachment styles, if you could take us through them a little bit more.
So the first will be secure attachment. And for secure attachment is low on both the dimensions of attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance. And what this means is that individuals with attachment security feels a sense of self-worthiness, and they trust in others to be there for them. They are comfortable with intimacy and closeness, and generally they have a sense of well-being and feel competent in regulating their emotions and needs in relationships. The second I will talk about is avoidant or dismissing attachment. So individuals in this attachment style have relatively high levels of attachment avoidance, relatively low levels of attachment anxiety. So they, on the surface, they might look like secure attachment individuals, but really underlying that is could be a lot of distress whenever it comes to relationship. So these individuals have compulsive self-reliance. They fear closeness and intimacy, and they try to avoid them at all costs. And sometimes they might then focus on other aspects like work, achievements, and they might say relationships don't matter to me. So they really, really fear vulnerability. Then the third style is what we call anxious or ambivalent attachment style. And for these people, they score relatively high on the dimension of attachment anxiety, relatively low on the dimension of attachment avoidance. They often come with a lot of hypervigilance, fear of abandonment. They think of themselves as unworthy. They might exhibit behaviors like wanting to be really, really close to their partners. And there's a lot of physiological arousal and distress. Then the last attachment style is what we call fearful avoidant or disorganized attachment. Often this group of people has experienced quite profound trauma in their relationships growing up. They are high on both the dimensions of attachment anxiety and avoidance. So these individuals, they might actually switch between behaving like an avoidant attachment style or the anxious attachment style, and they have a lot of difficulty in regulating their emotions, their needs. They could be quite confused as to what they need, and they could have a dissociation or freeze response pretty often whenever they feel threatened.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing more about that, because I know it's important to distinguish what each attachment style is, because like we've mentioned, social media, it like makes us think about each thing in a different way. Like based on my understanding of attachment styles, I think of an anxious attachment style as someone who's just anxious. And that's based off simply what social media has told me. So it's really important to clarify that. So thank you so much for doing that for us.
Thank you.
Yeah, and going off of, trauma, can you help us understand sort of the diversity of attachment styles and sort of elaborate on how traumatic experiences can influence these attachment styles and how we develop them?
Yes. I think, first of all, let's frame our conversation today in terms of understanding trauma as relational trauma. So relational trauma then refers to an assault or a violation of trust in a relationship. And what this means is that when we say that somebody has relational trauma or complex trauma, this individual has experienced repeated or prolonged experiences of interpersonal violation to trust and boundaries, and often in a way that is inescapable because of various constraints, such as social constraints, family constraints, maturational constraints. So one example is that if we, for some reason, have to be living with a family member who is abusive, or have to be in a professional relationship that we cannot get away from, that can be traumatic. So to understand the impact of trauma, we need to see when this trauma, such relational trauma, happens in our life. What we know from research is that when such trauma happens very early on in life, especially in the first 2 years when we are pre-verbal, and then later on in the first 5 years of our life, it has a particularly profound impact on our well-being, because at this stage, babies are very vulnerable and their nervous system is not mature. So the same trauma that happens during this very early period of our life can have profoundly more significant impact and then shape our attachment patterns more so than if it were to happen later on in our lives. So we call this first period a sensitive period because of our brain is still developing. How it impacts attachment is that when traumatic experiences occur in our lives, then they overwhelm our nervous system, and usually we go through our lives remembering events as sort of like a coherent story. But when trauma happens, we are unable to have this coherent story. What instead happens to us is a sense of that overwhelm of the system, and we remember the events as bits and pieces, and they are not integrated. So when this happens, how it affects attachment is that, particularly if the trauma happens in the context of with our caregivers in intimate relationships, then we have this sense of fear, and it's almost like an approach avoidance conflict, where we are supposed to be able to derive trust and a sense of worthiness from this person, and we are supposed to go to this person for safety and comfort. But then this person also turns out to be the source of fear for us. So we want to go, but we kind of get stuck, so we freeze, and then this can predispose us to develop what we say is unresolved part of our experience, which can then lead to disorganized attachment.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. So, do you think that, for example, when we get into relationships, that the relationships we're in can change and mold our attachment styles? For example, you enter a relationship and you're not really sure of your attachment style, but then you start to become very insecure in the relationship, and you come out of the relationship having a more anxious attachment style. Do you think that the way you are in a relationship with someone can form your attachment styles?
Would you be referring to an adult relationship, like a peer-to-peer relationship or a romantic relationship?
Let's go with like a romantic relationship.
Yeah. So presumably this romantic relationship happens later on in our lives. Maybe we are in young adulthood. So how we respond to that the trauma in this relationship is very much also influenced by the kind of attachment pattern we have developed with our earliest caregivers. So let's suppose we have developed a secure attachment, which means we are low in both attachment anxiety and avoidance. It means that we have developed in us this sense of internal felt security, which gives us a sense of that safety in us. And we also trust that, hey, there's someone there, there probably is someone there that we can turn to when we encounter difficulties, right? So if we get into a romantic relationship that turns out to be toxic or abusive, that internal security in us is almost like a kind of psychological immunity. So when things happen, right, we are bolstered by that. We are kind of protected by that, and we might be less likely to internalize the what's happening in the abusive relationship as something because we have done wrong or we are bad. And so it's almost like it's easier for us to then be able to protect ourselves in that. Having said that, having developed secure attachment with our caregivers earlier on is not a guarantee that we will remain so for the rest of our lives. So if we then get into a romantic relationship where we are repeatedly interacting with someone who makes us feel small, who confuses us, who evokes a lot of fear in us, who betrayed our trust, we can actually shift away from attachment security to then start to internalize some of the undesirable aspects of the relationship to then shift towards insecurity.
And that's so interesting. So how do you go from that to rebuilding your attachment style to be more secure, or to not, take the negative parts of that relationship and make it a part of who you are?
Yeah. So what we know is that when we had experienced trauma very early on, then if the trauma has resulted in us developing relational trauma, PTSD, that increases our vulnerability to then develop subsequent trauma or subsequent episodes of PTSD from that. So it's most like there's a compounding effect. So to look at how we can come out of a toxic relationship and reclaim attachment security, it is very important to also consider what had happened before that toxic relationship. Because as mentioned, secure attachment or attachment security with that psychological immunity then already builds sort of like a foundation for us. So then coming out of a toxic relationship might mean that, we have to kind of take stock again, regroup, recollect ourselves, and go and look at the resources that we already have had accumulated over time. And it might mean a lot of going back to the safe relationships that we have, to have that space to feel not judged, to make sense of our confusing experiences, and then learn not to blame ourselves for something that is not our responsibility. And importantly is to then make use of these supportive relationships to rebuild that sense of felt security in us. However, if before this toxic relationship, we experience unsafe relationships already with our closest people, that means we already have attachment insecurity or even disorganized attachment, then these are vulnerabilities that can be further compounded and further activated in this current toxic relationship. And hence, we are likely to behave in ways that are biased by our insecure attachment patterns. Yeah. Now, if you look at disorganized attachment, it often then is associated with quite profound inability to trust ourselves, to make use of the resources that we might have, to be able to trust people. And it might come with a lot of difficulties in regulating our emotions, even regulating our attention. It can come with a lot of somatic distress. And for these situations then, to reclaim attachment security will actually require that individual to get in touch with a professional who is trauma-informed and attachment-informed.
Okay, great. So you recommend professional help for people wanting to rebuild their attachment style, especially after a traumatic relationship or a history of, traumatic relationships?
I think it's really important, not because we are pathologizing this pattern, but because we appreciate the profound nature in how we can get impacted by toxic relationships. And this is not just we are going to feel this way or behave this way, but when we look at complex trauma and we look at PTSD and the neuroscience research behind that, we are acknowledging how the brain chemistry, the neural networks are being involved as well. And hence, then we need to support these individuals through appropriate interventions by working with individuals who are trauma and attachment informed.
Yeah. And are there any other strategies that people can use themselves to help rebuild their attachment security after experiencing trauma in a relationship?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So I think, so when we look at the research, what is very crucial, let's say parents have experienced trauma in their lives, right? What is very crucial for parents not to pass on that trauma to the next generation is their capacity for reflecting on their experiences. So what we know is that it is not so much what individuals recall about what happened to them, but really their stance towards what has happened to them. That is a better predictor of whether attachment security or insecurity will happen. And so what this means is that it is so important for us to cultivate some practices that support us in reflecting on ourselves. And that could be then through things like mindfulness practices or meditative practices. But for some individuals, this might even include things like yoga, sitting down and listening to music, making art, essentially practices that allow these individuals to sit with themselves and have that space to connect back with their own felt experience without judging them. And so this connection increases the individual's self-awareness, and then this self-awareness then promote them to then make sense of what has happened, and so that's one. Another strategy that's really important would be like mindful self-compassionate practices, which are very well researched on, and yeah, there's a whole host of different things that people can do.
I'd love to ask about how mindfulness can play a role in, this process of rebuilding attachment style and rebuilding oneself after something traumatic happens, like a traumatic relationship or a relationship that's really impacted us and our sense of security.
Yeah. So when we say trauma has happened, we are appreciating the profound effect it has on our how our brain and neural networks get activated. So what usually happens is that the midbrain is like the alarm center. It just goes off, and then it just trigger very automatic, instinctive, reactive responses that are that may or may not be helpful all the time. And what mindfulness does is like a pause button. So when we practice mindfulness, we are essentially learning how to take a step back from our automatic thoughts, feelings, sensations, and then we look at it from a curious stance, non-judgmental, and just observe, And this space then is that pause button that then allow us to not just react, but then decide, okay, what's going on here? How can I then decide how to respond? So in doing that, it helps us to take a step back, and it opens up the space for us to change our relationship with what has happened to us. And hence change the narrative of how we see ourselves and how we feel ourselves in relation to the traumatic event that has happened to us.
Yeah. And do you think that it's important to build secure attachments within ourselves? Is that what we should all be working toward?
This is a very interesting question, Johanna, because when we talk about it like that, right, there is an assumption because we are living in a relatively safe society where attachment security is the most adaptive response, arguably, in our day-to-day engagement, it might not be so in more tumultuous places where it is important to not trust so easily. But assuming our environment is relatively safe, then building attachment security is really about building a sort of very intimate, very close relationship with ourselves and feeling that, I can trust myself. I can trust myself to be there to meet my needs. And I can trust myself to tell me, okay, how am I feeling in this situation is valid, rather than questioning ourselves and then counting on other people to validate ourselves, which really increases our vulnerability to rejection and then to follow standards rather than what really speaks true to us. So if we want to look at how to cultivate a sort of healthy relationship, which has a balance of that connection and individuality, we want to start with ourselves, because the more we feel comfortable with ourselves and secure, the more then we bring that into the relationship, and it helps us to understand and navigate boundaries, needs in a way that's both respectful for us as well as respectful to the other person.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great way to put it. Like, you start with yourself before that relationship. And I wanted to dive into some practices and habits and specifically hone in on maybe one strategy or tool that you could recommend to recover from toxic relationships.
I think it has to go back to some kind of practice that supports self-reflection again. And I think I like to suggest for people to do something from mindful self-compassion, because mindful self-compassion incorporates both mindfulness practices as well as the compassion aspect, which is so needed when we hurt so much, coming out from a toxic relationship. One mindful self-compassionate exercise I like is called the soothing touch exercise. And it's basically like a visualization exercise that gives you instructions on how do you discover soothing touch for yourselves. And it can be as simple as just putting two hands on your heart and breathing and curiously observing your responses to that. Why this is so important is because when we engage in a soothing touch exercise, then that exercise involves warmth, soothing voice, as well as physical affectionate touch. And these three different things are important in activating our caregiving system, which then helps us to downregulate and calm down our distress. But fundamentally, I think it then also helps us to nurture a kind attitude towards ourselves in our experiences. So, something hurtful already happened to us. We don't need to hurt ourselves further by then putting ourselves down because of that. This is not to say we don't take accountability, but it's really removing that blame from coming out of that toxic relationship. Yeah.
And I think that blame can really damage us further, because we come out of that toxic relationship and sometimes we already feel really insecure about ourselves, and we come out of that relationship feeling like it's our fault and we're the reason to blame for why everything happened, why the relationship ended, or why we feel the way we feel, like we feel really down about ourselves. So for people really struggling, how do you recommend they implement this practice into their daily life or their routine?
We try to be realistic about it. So we aim for something really small. And so if being compassionate to ourselves can mean, I just get up and do my bed, and then that could be that. Or specifically to incorporate soothing, for example, soothing touch exercise, I would suggest for people to set a regular time every day, a time where they think is the easiest, the least resistance for them to be able to implement that, and to really have a protected time to do that, so that it's not something that you have to come to that moment and then debate with yourself whether you do it or not. And it could be really difficult to get started because if the critic inside is so strong, but to put it as something that is protected and planned, that can be a way to turn it into a habit. And hopefully with enough practice of that, and then we are talking about a few weeks, then it can become internalized and become second nature.
Yeah. And I think that idea of routine seems really important because when you come out of a toxic relationship, things can seem really uncertain and all over the place. And there's no sense of sort of security or that person, that even though you might have feared them, you still went to them for things. And now things can feel very insecure and like you are very confused. So having that routine, that set thing to do can give you just a bit more clarity or certainty in your life in this period of time.
Yeah, part of rebuilding that stability again.
Yeah, definitely. And how do you think this process of rebuilding our stability can, change our perception of relationships?
Well, the practices, I think our perception of relationship, how we see relationships actually start with how we experience the relationship with ourselves. And hence, if cultivating these practices help us to become more in touch with our moment-to-moment felt experience and to learn how to read our needs from these feelings, and then learning how to then be consistent and committed in responding to ourselves. When we learn how to trust ourselves, we develop that security, and then it can help us to experience ourselves differently and hence relationships differently. It's really hard to trust when we come out of a toxic relationship, right? To trust in others when we also find it so difficult to trust ourselves, because it's like, who can we turn to? We can feel really vulnerable and shaky.
Yeah, definitely. And coming out of a toxic relationship, how do you prepare yourself for your next relationship to be different or not to be informed by the trauma or, the insecure attachment from the previous one?
This is a very big question, and really, there's the principle is not that much different than what we have discussed earlier on as well. So perhaps I can talk a little bit more about how to strengthen that trust, that security. And usually we look at three principles there, which is availability, responsiveness, and consistency. And availability means that whenever available, possible, we are there for ourselves. And when we are there for ourselves, we learn how to read our feelings and our needs correctly, or try to be correct most of the time. And then to actually do that consistently. And over time, what this does is that it starts to help us to learn how to regulate our needs and emotions. But this is really just one aspect, because the reality is, if a toxic relationship has impacted us so much that it has resulted in PTSD, then it is something that requires a more targeted approach, which involves processing the trauma as well, in order for us to really get to the core of what feels so unsafe for us.
Yeah. And I think that sort of feeling of unsafe, feeling not safe, and feeling like you're in danger almost can be really harmful, especially coming out of a relationship and feeling like you're scarred by what's happened before. So we've talked about like self-compassion, which is really important. Are there any other sort of mindfulness practices we can bring in as well?
Um, I so like somatic experiences, experiencing all the somatic practices, sitting with our body, things like the yoga, which because we look at Peter Levy's research, how trauma is stored in the body and how then moving the body, connecting with that helps to release the energy as well. So things for that. And rather than introducing these activities in a general manner, we really want to ask the individual, hey, in your story, in your history growing up, what are the things that you have found yourself turn towards? what do you like? What do you love? What gives you joy? What helps you to feel alive? And that answer can be different for different people. For some people, it might be bushwalking, it can be, making music. So we look at how can we then take such experiences from individuals' lived experience and then tap on their strengths and then go from there. So it's not so much of giving something new to them, but really help them to uncover what is the strength that they have and then building on that.
Yeah, so it can really be a time to really get to know yourself and get to know what your strengths are and getting in touch with what makes you feel secure.
Yeah, at least to have a sense of beginning sense of that comfort, because for these individuals to think about safety can be a far stretch from the start at the start. So it is really a process rather than, okay, I do this and then it's going to be gone.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing those strategies with us, because I feel like sometimes it can be really daunting and overwhelming coming out of a toxic situation or a relationship and not feeling like you know what to do, especially now that you don't have that other person. You can feel very lost. So it's important to have practices or a new routine you can turn to in those cases as well.
Could I add on to that as well? Because so far the practices that we talk about, we look at focusing on the self, but it's also important that we don't go away thinking that, hey, it all falls back on me and myself only, and which might actually increases that sense of isolation coming out of a toxic relationship. So as much as possible is to build the individual's capacity to then look at connecting with others again, and how so it might be tapping on the existing relationships that feel safe enough, and then just being there to get a sense that, okay, I'm not alone in all this. Or sometimes this relationship might start with a professional therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember as well. So thank you so much for that. I'd love to transition to our open mic now. So I'd love to hand it over to you. And yeah, it's a space for you to talk about whatever you would like to.
So I am very passionate about the attachment framework. And so my practice, the Psychology Atelier, which I found that was anchored on the attachment principles as well in how we engage ourselves as well as others. And we really go back to the principles of sustainability, which is how do we lead a sustainable life, as well as psychological safety, which is really the cornerstone for us to then feel safe to connect and to explore. So I really hope that individuals will get to know more about the attachment research, and then for them to apply the principles and bring them into their day-to-day life, living, loving, and learning.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Living, loving, and learning. I love that. And on the lines of getting to know about attachment sort of styles, and we mentioned that social media has really sort of exacerbated these certain types of attachment styles, and we're very used to hearing about attachment through social media. What's the best way to learn more about our attachment styles beyond social media?
Well, I would actually recommend a website called Circle of Security International. They make use of 60 years of attachment research, and the angle is really looking at the parent-child relationship. But they have very nice and cute videos to understand our relationship with parents and our attachment needs all around the circle, which are applicable throughout the life. So people can go there and watch the videos as a starter for themselves, and really maybe not get so caught up in what is my attachment style, but really appreciating and asking what are my attachment needs and how I can take care of them.
Yeah, I like that, because sometimes we can think about, oh, what's my attachment style? And then you box yourself into that style and you think that's your personality trait, or that is who you are, as opposed to thinking about, what are my attachment needs? And that's very important.
Yeah, and when we look at attachment style, we almost always forget that there is a beginning and a backstory. And so, for example, our practice, we have this hashtag, we were all once a child. And this is to remind ourselves that whatever we look at it now, hey, there's a backstory, and let's reflect on what has happened to us early on as well and how that links to now.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to come back to this idea of like being compassionate with yourself, because we started off the video with the disclaimer saying that, you know, if this is something that will be emotionally activating, to be gentle with yourself. And I feel like regardless, it's so important to feel and be gentle with yourself, because we're dealing with emotions and attachment styles and relationships, especially if you've come out of traumatic relationships. So practicing that self-compassion is just really crucial to take care of yourself as well.
I totally agree.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, Lin. For those of us who want to find a bit more about you, where can we go?
They can visit our website, www.psychology.atelier.com, or they can go to our Instagram account. The handle is the.psychology.atelier, or my professional Instagram account, Hong-hui.psychologist.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And for those of you who missed that, don't worry. We've got it down in the description below. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You have been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.